Hi everyone, welcome back to another podcast. Today I'm joined with Kanishka and Viven, and we're going to be discussing the supposed killer gene. While the idea of a criminal gene is nonsense, there is growing evidence that some psychopathic behavior might indeed be grounded in genetics.
Yes, Ashish, as you mentioned, it is of course a complete myth. And essentially, the myth was started from a popular TV program called Riverdale. I'm sure many of our listeners have heard of it, perhaps even watch it. Essentially, what happened was research on a particular gene, the MAOA gene, which stands for monoamine oxidase A, was published. And in Riverdale, there's a series in which one of the characters, who's called Betty in the show, is told that they have the gene which gives them a tendency to violence and a likelihood of becoming a serial killer. It was known more casually as the serial killer gene in the series. This mention of the gene prompted many to believe that there was that the gene, which does genuinely exist, made people serial killers, which is a vast exaggeration. The MAOA gene is, of course, as I said, real, but has a very different purpose. Does anyone want to explain the true purpose of monoamine oxidase A?
Yes, so about MAOA, it's an enzyme, right? And it breaks down important neurotransmitters in the brain like dopamine and serotonin when they're no longer needed. So, like we talked about in the first podcast. Have you guys heard of the monoamine theory?
No, I haven't.
No.
So, there's this hypothesis of depression that predicts that the underlying pathophysiologic foundation of depression is reduced serotonin and/or dopamine in the central nervous system. So, there's several studies that have now found a correlation between the low activity form of the MAOA gene and aggression.
So the case against specific alleles has been accumulating, notably for the low expression variant of MAOA, and it's
Mm.
been linked in various studies with increased risk of violent and aggressive behavior. So, as Viven mentioned, it's an enzyme that degrades amine neurotransmitters such as dopamine, noradrenaline, and serotonin, something that we mentioned in our depression podcast earlier in the year. And a
Hmm.
rare genetic disorder caused by MAOA mutation leads to an MAOA deficiency and, in turn, an excess of monoamine transmitters. And this can cause impulsive behaviors such as sleep disorder and extreme mood swings, as well as a tendency to violence, which is known as Bronner's syndrome. But while Bronner's syndrome is rare, having only identified in 5 males of one extended family, the MAOAL variant is extremely common and occurs in almost 40% of the population. So clearly, most of these people have never committed a crime or are outwardly violent. But a study has discovered that at least males with this variant have had the microbiological structural factors that would predispose or mean that they're more inclined to be violent.
So in reality, what's required is some sort of trigger, right, Ashish? So this could be abuse during childhood or any other trauma which triggers someone and tips them towards MAOAL and the allele. And that is when they're likely to actually become more violent and aggressive and potentially become serial killers, although this is quite unlikely. Furthermore, even with a trigger, it's not guaranteed. But there is an extent to which we can trust this research. For example, the MAOAL allele is expressed in 40% of men, that almost all of these are peaceful and civilized and have never committed a crime. So this notion that having these will make you uncontrollably violent is not really fair. Um, I don't think we're
Yeah,
well researched at present. And sorry, I was just going to say, I don't think we're well researched enough at present. We can't allow the possession of such a gene to control sentencing or crimes or anything like that. Do environmental or other factors
Yeah, of
affect?
course. So I think you summarized that perfectly there. And environmental factors obviously do play a part in the behavior of psychopaths, but it's in a different way to other people who develop antisocial tendencies. So the condition is more common than once was thought and affects almost 0.6% of the population, according to a recent study conducted in the UK. So obviously, psychopathy doesn't necessarily lead to crime or extremely violent behavior. Indeed, its occurrence in the population is significantly underestimated because it was only diagnosed in people that had already shown such a violent disposition or extreme
Mm.
behavior. And when there was a study, so there was a study that I researched, and there was 15 pairs of identical twins that were taken and put in different environmental factors, and their behavior was observed. And their findings were that prevention works needs to focus on strengthening potential protective factors and identifying specific environmental factors that contribute to the development of psychopathic personality traits. And what that means is that there are certain triggers in childhood that can make people more inclined to have a violent disposition compared to others. And Since environmental factors only explain half the variants, future research, as you mentioned about future research, it also needs to focus on the molecular, genetic, and brain imaging fields, which could help us discover biological mechanisms and neural circuitry pathways that have underlying psychopathic personality traits, and mean that we could potentially isolate a variety of spectrum of prognosis, which could give us a diagnosis of a serial killer. What about this being more common, like the violent disposition being more common in men than women?
Yeah, so there's the MAOA gene variant, but there has to be a trigger to shift people towards violence. So it could be any stressful situation, really. But there was an earlier study that explained this trigger could be persistent maltreatment during childhood. So maltreatment is cruel or violent treatment. Women are protected from that in two ways. The first is because the MAOA gene is linked to the X chromosome. So women with the MAOA variety on one chromosome have a normal allele on the other. And the other is because women are also protected by other genes from being disposed to violence. Now, psychopathy is also more common in men than women. It's understandable, to be honest. Like, it supports the theory that psychopathy is an adaptive personality trait because it gives men a reproductive advantage through greater tendency and ability to form numerous relationships and then have more children. It's understandable but not proven, but it is true that male psychopaths tend to have lots of short-term relationships and can have a seductive effect. This means that it might be true at the genetic and neurological level if some of the relevant genes are linked to the X chromosome. But again, it's not firm science, just a behavioral conclusion.
Hmm. I was just curious. So, for the people who do have an MAOA gene and perhaps develop some of the traits and tendencies such as the violence, what actual treatment is there, and how are they like managed?
So there's been a big interest in establishing the relationship of psychopathy to treatment outcome in civil psychiatric settings. So that's just the basic NHS treatment that we have, counseling essentially. And the study assessed patients diagnosed with major mental health diagnosis and compared those who are receiving minimal outpatient treatments. This means 0 to 6 sessions, to those receiving intensive outpatient treatment, which is 7 or more sessions every 10 weeks for 1 year. So measures of the treatment involvement and violence were based on patient self-reports. So this wouldn't be totally accurate. But when available, collateral reports and official records were used to determine rates of violence. And the majority of patients received a combination of verbal therapy and medication, or that being 37%, or verbal therapy only, which is 40%. And less common was medication only, 10%, and group therapy only, 5%. Drug and alcohol treatment or other forms of treatment were also available at 8%. So no other details on the modality or content of treatment was reported. So the authors report that in the highly psychopathic group, those individuals that were receiving 7 or more sessions, the intense outpatient sessions, were significantly less violent than those that were receiving 0 to 6 sessions. Sorry, and the percentage given was 6% versus 23% for the people that only received 0 to 6 sessions at the initial follow-up. However, there were no significant differences between treatment groups at any of the additional follow-up periods. So it was only the first session that there was a difference that was noticeable. So it's not the clearest study, and it's by no means the most accurate, but it gives us a little gauge at how a more intensive treatment plan in terms of counseling could benefit psychopathic people.
Yeah, the appropriate therapy will depend on the personality tendencies. And overall, psychopaths don't usually respond well to punishment because they can't associate it with actions they don't think are morally wrong. But they are more likely to respond to rewards. So I have this quote. One example of this is currently underway at a school in Buckinghamshire for primary age children with emotional and behavioral difficulties. There have been very encouraging reports from teachers so far. The intervention is largely reward based, and the pupils gain rewards by working toward reaching their behavioral targets each week. Pupils can cash in their rewards daily, or they can save them up for more substantial rewards later in the week. So they don't know if it will help those children to live constructive adult lives later, but it does show, even though it might not be possible to cure psychopaths, it may be possible to direct their selfishness from crime towards more creative activities.
I think it's interesting you mentioned that because with regards future potential and kind of prospects. I think understanding the gene will be somewhat useful in terms of assisting us with maybe explaining tendencies and understanding psychopaths to a further extent. But I don't think it will be suitable for, like I mentioned earlier, reducing sentences or anything like that on the basis of having the gene and possessing it. I feel like the most potential lies with using our knowledge of the gene, which we can hope to gain in the future, to understand and assist individuals who maybe who've had a trigger and now express some of the traits linked to the gene, and kind of cater treatment plans to their traits and base it off our knowledge of the gene. I think it is something that's it's good and useful to study, but has somewhat limited prospects in terms of this specific gene. Obviously, if we get onto the topic of understanding genes as a whole, that's completely different. But this specific gene, I think, has limited prospects and perhaps isn't necessarily a priority as such.
Yeah, and I would completely agree with that. And some argue the same point that you argue, that seeing as it doesn't make any difference to sentencing, there's not much further research that could be done or should be done, because there's very limited resources apart from very limited potential apart from the fact that you could help individuals that may struggle with psychopathic tendencies from a younger age, providing better outcomes for their future. I think that's brings our podcast to a close.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. If you have any comments or any ideas for future podcasts, leave them in the Google Forms in the description below. Like and share the video, subscribe to the channel, follow our Instagram and Twitter handles, and we'll see you on the next one.